Welcome, everybody. My name's Amar Bhattacharya. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings Institution, also a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics, the Grantham Research Institute, and I have the privilege to moderate this session. We are in the second day in the afternoon, so energy is difficult, but I think this is a important session, and I have a great panel, so I'm sure we will lift up both thoughts and energy, to the right level. As you know, the title of this session is Climate Finance, Trade, and the Role of Multilateral Institutions in the context of COP28 and beyond. And, I think it is fair to say that, just like the Glasgow COP was a special COP, I think this COP will also be a special COP. And let me explain why. For one fundamental reason, that, the climate emergency is now seen really as an emergency. It's also the year where there will be the first stock take, so we will find that we are not doing so well. So it's important year, and it's also a year where the issues we are discussing, which is climate finance, the role of multilateral institutions, and the issues of trade will figure quite prominently. So this panel indeed is quite appropriate. I want to make a couple of empirical observations. First, that we are not going to be able to meet the climate goals unless we meet them everywhere, and particularly unless we meet them in the global south, for two reasons. One is climate change is occurring at an extremely rapid pace, and the impact is falling particularly on the poor and vulnerable. So, acting on climate change is extremely important to deal with the intersection between poverty, vulnerability, and climate. And second, because the global south, excluding China, will account for the vast preponderance of emissions going forward. Now, in all of this, we need to be able to undertake massive investment, but with the power of innovation, with the power of changes, such as, that were discussed, like the lifestyle for the environment. But for all of this, we will need finance at scale, and I think that will come out very much in the discussions we will have. The role of multilateral institutions, not just in the provision of finance, but in the actions as well as in the finance, will be critical, and there are going to be very important trade dimensions. So with that, let me open this up to the panel. We have an excellent set of speakers, and as you've seen in the program, the first speaker is Hans-Peter Lankes, who is a visiting professor also at of practice at the London School of Economics. He's also a senior fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, and also with the IGC Oxford LSE project. He was previously Vice President of Economics and Private Sector Development. Impressed, no? I remember that. And he was also held very senior positions at EBRD, the IMF, in academia, in the private sector. But the main point I want to highlight is he led a very, very important independent report for the German G7 on the issue of the Climate Club, together with Lord Nicholas Stern. I was also privileged to be part of that exercise. And it's from that perspective that I would like to really ask him to make his remarks, which is, how is that club going to help or not help in the agenda that we are looking at right now? So the floor is yours, Hans-Peter.
Thank you very much, Amar. So in practice, we're going to continue a conversation that we started yesterday with that excellent presentation by Professor Ed Barbier. I'll come back to some of the issues that we raised. I think Professor Barbier is probably also going to come back, and we hope that we can have that lively conversation that we had yesterday. Just to take a step back on what the nature of this climate club is, at least as it is evolving, the task force is being created, and then we have the terms of reference, and by the end of the year, we will hopefully have the official launch of this club. It would be an intergovernmental forum led from the top that would give it the opportunity to look across departments and to, what I would call, as an economist, make gains from trade by looking across the trade, the finance, sectoral briefs, and a variety of other topics. That gives it its uniqueness in the broader landscape of fora that are out there. And the idea, at least as I see it and as it seems to be evolving, is that this forum would be a relatively flexible way to target blocks, obstacles to the climate agenda, to climate ambition. It's a fairly wide field of possibilities that would be defining the agenda. And we cannot really say today exactly where this agenda is going to land. But within that wide field, I want to highlight 3 points that I think are particularly important. One is one that has been discussed quite a lot, that is very prominent in the conversation, that has been emphasized by the German G7 presidency, and that is the role in enabling, in supporting sectoral alignment, in particular in industries that are trade exposed and heavy emitters. Sectoral alignment in these industries, in a way, having a possibility to a framework within which to discuss decarbonization path is a win-win for all sides. There's almost no need to have a club for that. We have fora in which this is supposed to happen, like the IDDI, which looks at construction materials and the technological evolution in those, at possibilities of aligning government procurement. And we have other fora of that sort. So that forum would be an opportunity to drive technological standards and therefore create common expectations around the path of certain technologies, green steel, hydrogen, cement, and others. It would also be offer a forum to agree on common policies for how to support these technologies, creating lead markets, green public procurement contracts, carbon contracts for difference, or other tools that might be available to drive technological development along these paths. So this is quite an important part of the agenda, I believe, and it's, in my view, a part that can move ahead even today, even before we have the formal launch of the Climate Club. There's a lot of demand from industry for that. The second aspect that I want to highlight is the role of the Climate Club in reconciling trade frictions. The climate agenda is going to create a whole range of trade frictions because countries are following different policy mixes. We got a taste of that yesterday. The establishment of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms by the EU and some other countries is raising these issues. The IRA in the United States, the subsidy regime, is raising these issues. They have trade implications, and these trade implications need to be managed. Otherwise, they become a source of blockage for the common climate agenda. And the Climate Club can be a forum in which to discuss common rules, common definitions. We heard about the measurement issues that are involved. But also to get together and pursue these issues in the context of the WTO, which I believe will be very important to give them legitimacy. And the WTO is a forum that is open to discussions around rules on environmental trade. So if a group of countries comes together and advances these issues in the context of the of the appropriate working groups in the WTO, that will carry weight. And it is important to do that. Rules around green subsidies, rules around the implementation, the administrative side, for instance, of the implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, those things. And the third point that I would like to raise, perhaps the most important here, is the role that the Climate Club should play in agreeing financial cooperation. There is a pillar on partnerships, and it is meant to cover trade, among others, technology and technical cooperation. It does not get much visibility. There is a timidity around that pillar, around the concept that finance must be central to a successful climate club. But let's look at this from the perspective of the Global South, which is going to be responsible for the vast majority of emissions going forward. What interest does the Global South have to join such a climate club? What capacity does the Global South have to implement the ambition that this club envisages? Finance is the central component from the perspective of many countries in the Global South. There is a proposal on the table, the Global Climate Alliance, promoted by Jayant Sinha from India, which makes that very clear and which takes a very creative look at how the financial cooperation can happen. Without the investments in the Global South, decarbonization path in the Global South that require investments and the finance for that, we are not going to achieve our climate goals. So finance must be a central pillar here. And to close, the need here is, and the opportunity for the Climate Club is to be creative about finance. Apart from the country platforms like the JETPs, there is a regulatory dimension where investments in infrastructure, long-term investments in emerging markets are hit by a triple whammy of regulations that create obstacles to finance flowing to them through Basel, through solvency, through a variety of other tools. They need to be looked at, they need to be reviewed from the perspective of this agenda. The MDBs are a very important tool for the climate finance agenda. They need to scale up. We know that the Climate Club members, the G7, can come behind that agenda. And there is a need to find new sources of concessionality. We are sort of running out of momentum on ODA. We have to look for other sources. Be creative about that. Carbon markets, global tax on shipping, global tax on aviation, or using tax credits like the IRA does, but to support the agenda of investments in climate in the Global South. Those are the things that I would like to see feature prominently in the Climate Club agenda.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. So that's a natural segue to you, Professor Ed Barbier, and you made an excellent keynote yesterday where you argued for G7 leadership on ambition and policy, initiating the Climate Club, and indeed, as Hans-Peter said, putting central importance on finance. So in introducing you, I should say that you are a university distinguished professor in economics at Colorado State University, senior scholar in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, with really an extensive and impressive research record in the field. And you also have produced a very relevant paper for the ADBI, which I commend. So with that, if I could turn it over to you, and if you could maybe pick up on the points, the key points from your presentation, and also if you want to respond to anything that Hans-Peter said.
Thank you, Ahmad. I really appreciate it. Excellent. I really appreciate those comments, Hans-Peter. They're very clear and very apt to the points that I think are very important. Let me start with a big picture first. We are in Japan, and the major sport here is baseball. So I will use a baseball analogy, which is that the world is starting off going into Cup this year with 2 strikes against it. The first strike is time. We just simply do not have the time to waste anymore to make concerted major global action on controlling and reducing emissions. The second strike is money. We just came out of a major global pandemic, which was expensive, not just costly to our economies, but we spent, our governments, our expenditure was in the, by the G20 and mainly by the G7, was in the tens of trillions of dollars. And we came out of the pandemic with emissions rising again. So those 2 strikes against us, when we want to have quick and rapid cuts in emissions, is a real challenge. And I believe, as I outlined yesterday, that a climate club led by the G7 is a necessary part of the solution, but it's not sufficient. And it's not sufficient unless it can be created in a way so that it has carrots and sticks to get as many countries to join in as possible. And the challenge for a climate club, as I mentioned yesterday, is that it needs to be effective in reducing emissions, which is urgent. It needs to have 2 mechanisms. One is agreed common policy, particularly on carbon prices, or the equivalent of carbon prices from regulations, that all countries should have as a minimum criteria for joining into the club. And I suggested a number of policies yesterday that could make that happen. The second thing it needs to have, and this is unfortunately one of the sticks, is it does need to have import or some kind of penalty in order to protect the integrity of the policies, to prevent carbon leakage, to protect those industries that are most vulnerable through trade. And Hans-Peter mentioned the sector that we need to start with, which is the emission-intensive and trade-exposed sectors of iron, steel, chemicals, cement, and so forth. Yes, we need cooperation on reducing emissions. Yes, we need more innovation. But we also, with the Climate Club, need to come down the route of thinking about import levies as one mechanism, as I suggested yesterday. Now, another carrot here is that I mentioned that if we do go down this route, we should have certain incentives in order to encourage countries, particularly emerging market and developing economies, to joining in the club and even being involved in its establishment. And one is to have a differentiated price of a minimum carbon price for those that join. That does mean a commitment in terms of pricing reforms and policies. And the suggestion that comes out of the International Monetary Fund is that we should have perhaps $75 per ton of carbon dioxide for high-income countries, so like the G7, $50 per ton for middle-income countries, and $25 for low-income countries. And the import levy should be the same. If we impose them, if we use them first for the emission-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, they should have the same differentiation. And this does 2 things. First of all, it does put most of the burden of the cuts of emissions on the high-income countries, so it's somewhat progressive. Secondly, it's more of an incentive to encourage, as I said, emerging market economies to join. And thirdly, there's another carrot here, which is the import levies can then be the source of the money. Remember, that's one of the strikes. We just don't have trillions of dollars to spend, but we need to have that type of scale. And we could use the import levy funds. The high-income countries that are members of the Climate Club could create a facility from the revenues of the import levy and use it to fund the sort of things that Hans-Peter talked about and which I talked about yesterday, expanding JETPs, the just energy transition, putting infrastructure investments in emerging market economies, and most importantly, what I talked about yesterday, which is aiding those countries to develop the type of pricing mechanisms, incentives, investments, innovation, adoptions in their economies that would allow them to A, join the club, B, to make progress in controlling emissions as they grow and develop, and C, target key development aims, particularly poverty alleviation. And I think that's incredibly important. So would I say if we had plenty of time, would a climate club be my first choice? No, it would not. I would prefer to have a much more protracted agreements where we actually get some more consensus. But we had that time. We had that time 20, 30 years ago. We don't have that luxury. And similarly on the money side, we don't have trillions of dollars. I don't think the G7, the multilateral banks have that type of capital that we need to urgently invest. And as I agree with Dr. Bhattacharya, it's got to go into emerging market and developing economies because that's where the new emissions and the fastest growing emissions are coming. So that was the basis of what I was proposing yesterday as a framework. It's not ideal, but I think it's urgent. We don't want that third strike because then we're out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Babier. I mean, and I think this theme of urgency, we should keep coming back to, and what does that mean for the agenda? So our next panelist is Kazuo Matsushita. I've had the privilege to see him as a passionate voice for climate and environment here in Japan. And he's currently Senior Fellow at the Institute for Global and Environmental Studies, Professor Emeritus at Kyoto University, and also the T7 Japan TF2 co-chair, which is very relevant. And you've had an extensive career before that, including in the Ministry of Environment, at the OECD and at UNCED. So really have the basis to answer the question I'm going to put to you, which is, the G7, has failed to deliver on the climate finance commitment that was made in 2009 and reaffirmed at COP16, and it's been a perennial source of distrust in the climate negotiations. This is a very important year, and how do you think the Japanese G7 can give impetus to the delivery of that commitment? Second, as you have also made clear, we need to go way beyond that in mitigation, in adaptation, in loss and damage, and in nature. So what do you see as the role of the G7 right now in taking the climate finance agenda forward?
Thank you very much, Amar, for your very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here with all the distinguished panelists and Amar. Yeah. First of all, let me share, with you the urgency of the climate crisis, as Ed already expressed. Rapid and far-reaching transition across all sectors and systems are necessary to achieve immediate, deep, rapid, and sustained reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions and secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Yeah. So I will talk a bit more in general terms as served as Task Force 2 based on the discussion on Task Force 2 on well-being, environmental sustainability, and just transition. So for the G7 nations, based on and informed by the latest scientific findings, G7 nations should commit to continuing their leadership role with all committed partners to take immediate and concrete actions to drive down emissions to keep a limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise within reach and build resilience to climate impacts globally. Then in this regard, there is an urgent need for the G7 to deliver on its commitment to increase finance for climate, the SDGs, and other initiatives. The G7 has a particular responsibility to not only deliver its fair share on the globally needed mitigation efforts, but also to support the necessary just transition and management of climate risks and the impacts. The G7 scaled-up finance assistance should aim to balance mitigation and adaptation. And G7 should also finance from the sources to strengthen ambitious climate and biodiversity actions and ensure robust policies and systems are in place to facilitate private actors to align their financial flows. G7 countries should scale up their support to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage, particularly in vulnerable developing countries, including delivering on the G7's climate and disaster risk finance and insurance commitments, and working towards a global shield against climate risks. And G7 countries need to synergize their finance for climate and biodiversity finance through nature positive investment and climate finance with nature core benefits. In this connection, multi-stakeholder dialogue at all levels are critical to synergizing SDGs and climate actions. Also, stronger support for education, science, and technology is necessary to strengthen youth participation in scaling up their efforts to accelerate climate action and their implementation of the SDGs. I should also like to encourage more positive climate action, including in the private sector, and encourage entities to commit to greenhouse gas net zero emission for themselves and throughout the value chains. In this regard, I would like to stress that claims on the environmental performance of various entities should be reliable, comparable, and verifiable to empower consumers, corporations, and investors to accelerate efficient emission reductions and reduce the risk of inappropriate use in line with the principles of decided in the conclusion of the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda, IDA. Based on the above, the G7 should first strengthen the effective carbon market and carbon pricing system that promote rapid greenhouse gas reductions and the just transition. Second, intensify efforts to develop, align, and implement science-based sustainable finance taxonomies. Third, make disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities mandatory for all publicly traded companies, large private companies and government-linked financial institutions, and adjust prudential frameworks to account for climate-related and other environmental risks. Finally, on the issue of Climate Club, I welcome the recent focus on processes to support the global south, including capacity building, technological cooperation, and technology transfer, and strengthening sector-based cooperation, such as steel, cement, and the development of green hydrogens, among others. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Kazuo. So our last panelist, but you know, we always save the best for the last, is Stormia Annika Milner. I have had the privilege, I don't know, knowing her for how long, but she's been very, very active in the G7 and T7 and the T20 for a long time. She is currently the executive director of the Aspen Institute in Germany. She was head of external economic policy at BID, the Federation of German Industries, a member of the executive board of the German Institute for International Security Affairs. And she's been quite, she's really worked a lot on trade and finance and also commodity markets. And it's from that perspective that, wanted to ask you, how do you see the links between the trade and the climate agenda, both as a reinforcement, but also as possible impediments?
Thank you so very much for the kind words and for not saying how long we actually know each other. I also want to express my gratitude to the organizers of the summit. I think it's a really, really meaningful and action-oriented exercise, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you so much for posing the question to me regarding the relationship between climate and trade and trade and climate. But first of all, I also want to underline the urgency of the matter. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges mankind is currently facing, if not the major challenge. And so it comes naturally that it's on the top of the agenda, both of the G7 and the G20. And while I also see that there is some progress, and I brought along a number from an OECD study which finds that in 2001, G20 economies priced 49% of CO2 emissions from energy use. Those increasing ambitions are by no means the same in all countries, in all G20 countries or G7 countries, but levels of ambition vary and progress varies. And I very much agree that we don't have so much time. And while multilateral approaches would be certainly better, we need to achieve progress. So we need to also look at plurilateral and bilateral initiatives. And when you mentioned the baseball analogy, I thought, can I come up with a sports analogy where teams are actually not playing against each other, but where they are playing together? Because what I think is that we are at a vital point where we need to be very careful not to create a soccer field with two teams playing against each other. Because while I believe it's the right way, the pragmatic way for like-minded countries to move forward, we need to be very careful that we, through measures which are to protect, could become protectionist, could lead to counter-reactions. And so I think we need to be very careful in what we are implementing. Why are we looking at the relationship between trade and climate? On one hand side, because as we heard, climate policies can have an immense impact on trade flows. And I don't know if we agree on this, but I would certainly say that trade is very important for our economic prosperity, well-being, economic growth, stability, job creation, innovation, and so on, has lifted billions of people out of poverty. So it's really important to safeguard an open, free, and just trading system. I hope that we agree on this. So the impact of climate policies on trade can be negative, but the other way around, trade policies can also have an impact on climate change, and trade has an immense impact on climate change. And so what I want to do is first look at that relationship a little bit more closely, and then go very briefly through different international initiatives and their pros and cons, where we could build on and where we need to be a little bit more careful. So on the first point, the relationship between trade and climate change can be looked in three dimensions: the scale, the composition effect, and the technology effect. So trade, through trade liberalization, there's more trade, can have an impact on economic growth, production, and that can go hand in hand with more energy consumption and more energy emissions, i.e. having a negative effect on climate and increasing climate change. Trade also has a composition effect. So it has an effect on what countries are producing according to their comparative advantages. And here again, it can either increase production of technologies, of products which are climate friendly, but it also could lead to the embedment or festament of technologies in some countries which are very energy consuming and CO2 intensive. So it can again have a positive and a negative effect. And then it also can have a technology effect by transferring technologies to countries, leading to the usage of more climate-friendly technologies, and now it can have a positive effect. So really to measure the effects is really, really difficult. And there have been some exercises which try to do so, and the WTO tried to summarize try to summarize the percentage of overall total CO2 emissions which can be directly or indirectly linked to trade and the production of traded goods and the transportation of traded goods. And they come to 20 to 30%. So that is pretty high. That is pretty high. And it's not just the trade in goods, it's also the trade in services. It depends a little bit on how services are traded, but if we think about digital services and you think about data centers, it becomes obvious that also services can be highly energy and CO2 intensive. So 20 to 30%, that is quite a chunk. And on the other side, there's also data which shows that through trade, the costs for energy-friendly technologies, such as solar technologies or wind turbine technologies, decreased massively through trade liberalization. Are there any studies which try to weight that against each other? No, because the data is just a little bit too inconclusive. But nonetheless, it shows us that there can be negative effects and it can be positive effects. And we now need to think about how can we minimize the negative effects and how can we harvest the positive effects. And that brings me to my second part, looking at different trade policy instruments. And the first one are bilateral ones. So many countries around the world have bilateral free trade agreements. And the United States, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, most of them also have chapters on sustainability. And some of them also hold countries accountable to multilateral agreements on climate issues. Some of them are enforceable under the Trade Dispute Settlement Agreement of such an FTA. In some FTAs, it's not the case. So what is good about this is that there is a linkage already embedded in these agreements. What is not so good is that it is very vague. There is nothing in there like carbon pricing. The enforcement mechanisms are really weak. And there are tons of FTAs which don't have sustainability chapters at all, especially among developing and emerging economies. So is it a best choice option? I would say no. It is something we should continue to pursue, but it's definitely not going to solve the issue. The second one, and it has been mentioned several times, is the WTO. You all know that the WTO is in crisis mode in all pillars, in negotiation, dispute settlement, monitoring. So it's in a very difficult stage anyways. In comparison to bilateral free trade agreements, it doesn't have an enforceable chapter or rules on environment, sustainability, or climate issues at all. So we are starting from a pretty low base here, and enforcement is hardly possible. I mean, you can point at some rules under the GATT, like Article 21, but it's really, there's nothing comprehensive in there. So there are currently 2 initiatives ongoing, and one is the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, in which 74 countries are participating, and it's a dialogues on plastics. And I think that's a good starting point. Those are plurilateral initiatives. They talk about fossil fuel subsidies, for example. But is this going to be sufficient? Probably not, because there are lots of hurdles to come to a more enforceable plurilateral agreement, and we see this with other initiatives in the WTO. It really, really takes a huge effort to agree on anything right now, even on plurilaterals. Last point or last avenue are unilateral issues. And this is, it has been mentioned before, for example, the Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which the European Union is currently finalizing. As a good European, I should sit here and defend that instrument. And I would also say and agree that we do need instruments like this to create a level playing field, to prevent leakages, but the dangers of such an instrument are also pretty high, I would say. And it is not just something which can lead to huge distortions between the North and the South, but also among the countries of the G7. And while I think that the Climate Club could be a first step, I'm also very curious if the G7 countries could ever agree on this, looking at the United States and the different or not existing pricing mechanisms and so on. So when the European Union is going to go it alone, which it is probably going to do in the beginning, it needs to be very careful how to implement it, I would say. So it's good to have a transition period in the beginning where importers are not paying anything yet, where the mechanism is tested. But then this period needs to be used to really see how it works, how the carbon price can be, carbon intensity can be determined, the price can be determined, what to do then also with the money, how to use it. Right now, it doesn't say anything about then spending the money also on climate finance issues in third countries. So that needs to be definitely in there. So that is something which is probably very likely to come, but we need to be very careful about this. So lots of deficits in the existing mechanism. Where does this lead us? Hopefully not with pessimism, but with an idea on where we should continue to work on. And I would say, to conclude, we need to work on all those fronts: the FTAs, the WTO, and the unilateral instruments. And do so in a way to be very careful not to create more distortions, because then, and more discrimination, because then we could get into a scenario where actually the costs might be higher than the benefits.
Yeah, and there are also important supply chain issues. Yeah. So this is a complex area. Given the time, I just want to see if there are questions from the audience, and then I will, weave in maybe a few other things that in between. So I'm going to go from left to right, and if you could keep your interventions as questions, I would greatly appreciate it, so that we can cover, as many as possible. And please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Masanori Kobayashi from Ocean Policy Research Institute of Saseka Peace Foundation. Thank you for great discussions. I just wondered if you can pick just Japan, US, Germany, and compare this latest trend in terms of improving energy efficiency and the carbon intensity reductions. We see some difference, and in terms of the urgency, I don't know if finance, trade would be sufficient, or do we have to have other policy measures to accelerate these transitions? And I just wondered if you can comment on this as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to take a range of questions and then come back to the panel. Yes, the gentleman in the back.
My name is Kim Shumerkin, Associate Professor in Sustainable Finance and ESG at Kirch University, and I'm the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of Sparkasse, Luxembourg's largest bank. And I have a question, particularly also yesterday, Professor Barbier said, in terms of climate finance, the public sector is not enough. We need to mobilize private funds. And I have a question towards all the ESG investing, sustainable investing. How do you evaluate what is happening in the United States, where there's a lot of anti-ESG investing? BlackRock comes under fire for so-called woke investing. And it brings me to climate finance, because we, at the end of the day, there's a question around fiduciary duty. What is the role of an investor? And at the end of the day, you want to make money. And is it the role of financial institutions, including multilateral development banks, at the end to go fully concessionary, or to, at the end of the day, still generate? And should financial materiality be the key metric, or should there be non-financial metrics? So that is my question.
The two ladies right here, yes, please.
I'm Sayuri Shirai, a professor at Keio University, and I also work for Asian Development Bank Institute. I have a question about taxonomy. So EU has this green taxonomy, and a lot of countries have a different taxonomy and principle-based classification. But especially this transition finance and transition activities, I think every country have a very different divergent approach, right? So how to standardize this approach, and that is my first question. I mean, it looks very difficult to standardize it. So I'd like to know how to do it. The second question is that this GHG emission scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, it's good that it's promoted by TCFD guideline and ISSB, but I think we should make scope 1, scope 2 GHG emission mandatory and set a target, but more challenge is coming from scope 3, right? And I got the feeling that it's not many countries are willing to promote this disclosure with regards to scope 3. So maybe particularly to Professor Ranke and then other speakers, if you can make comment on that.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hannah Alexis Asilo, a graduate student, master's in the Philippines. And before my question, I would like to emphasize that it's true, it's a fact that we already had a lot of climate talks and forums on climate agenda, and we also had created what we thought were panacea to the global climate crisis, and it's a fact. And even though after all those years, however, there really is progress, we still don't have a strong pathway to solve the crisis. My question is, what will be the difference of the Climate Club to the other agreements and protocols such as the Kyoto and Paris Agreement with regards to the carbon market, trade crediting and offset, which presume that the relationship between emissions and climate change is linear, that a one-to-one trade-off is present between emissions and offset, and that a carbon credit is homogeneous or equally valuable, independent of when and where carbon dioxide was emitted. And my second question is, how can it make sure that the negative social consequences of the projects implemented in one country, especially in the developing countries, which was reported under the previous carbon market mechanisms, will be minimized or prevented? Thank you.
The last question from here, please.
We have a question from an online audience from Adil Kadri from Pakistan. So the Global South is very much strangled with debt crisis and macroeconomic fragility. So how would you work around this and enroll countries from the Global South with carbon taxes, which would make their operating costs higher and affect their global competitiveness? And then also, I have a question. My name is Derek Hondo from ADBI. You talked about time as an issue, and also there's all these fiscal constraints. So how do we, tapping into the private sector is one way, but since we don't have much time, how can we accelerate this? You talked about carbon markets, taxonomies, and mandating disclosure, but is there anything more, something faster we can do? Because some of these take time to involve the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to go again from the right. So Hans-Peter, if you start, and then we'll try to make sure that we cover all the questions as we go along.
So, thanks for giving me this task, Amar. This is a very difficult set of questions that we're getting, and I hope that others here on the panel will be able to fill the gaps. On the first question of comparing the intensity of change, I can't give it to you from my head. There are efforts, particularly at the OECD, where we heard about the forum for so there's a carbon measurement forum which has been kickstarted, but will take a couple of years before it will be able to put the data on a truly comparable basis. There are some other attempts. The IMF has made attempts to compare the intensity of measures across countries. It's useful to look at that. Typically, the European countries, if you put together the direct or implicit effect of different measures, and you calculate the carbon price equivalent, at least based on numbers that I have seen so far, European countries will tend to have a particularly strong impetus right now. But that has partly to do with the fact that we cannot capture all the elements. For instance, we do not capture very well technology policies and how national targets can guide different industries in particular directions. Those things are hard to capture. How do we capture the phasing out of the internal combustion engine in terms of today's impact as a price equivalent that we can then add up with other impacts? So those things are very difficult and are part of the reason that it is not easy to devise trade mechanisms that will be acceptable and be perceived as being fair by all parties. I fully agree on the importance of private finance. I think there is no question, if we look at the numbers, that a very large share of the burden will have to be with private finance, and it is nowhere to be found. Private finance into emerging markets and developing countries over the past 10 years has been going down. It hasn't been going up. After the Addis Declaration, the SDGs, the appeal for private finance, it has come down. And so the question is really, how do you change that? The issue there with legislation like in the US, which is quite obviously political and not linked to the facts, is of course not very helpful. Because one thing that I mentioned in what I said earlier is if we are a bit creative about how to give more of a boost to private finance, we should look at the same instruments that we're using domestically, like the IRA is using tax credits to steer finance in certain directions, but it does so within the United States. The EU has schemes under the what's it called, Generation EU, that do similar things. We need those instruments to apply globally. We need to have an incentive in the same way, in order to level the playing field, if anything, in the same way that we are steering, say, pension fund investments into certain long-term sectors domestically, to do so for investments across borders. That, for me, would be one important thing. And then I mentioned this, the issue of the impediments that Basel and certain other regulations impose, which can be quite considerable. So in terms of kickstarting and in terms of creating more momentum, there are other things, and I don't want to go into them now. There is the question of taxonomies, very important. And I'm personally quite disappointed by what's going on. I mean, we were all very hopeful when governments were beginning to get serious about creating these taxonomies. They're very important. But the taxonomies that I see don't capture the vast majority of the problem. They don't capture the transition cases. It's very easy to define something that's green and to define something that's black. But most of our reality is somewhere in between. And what we want is to stimulate the transition. We want the investments to be made in the right direction, the technologies to be invested in that are moving things in the right direction. And the taxonomies are not very helpful in that regard. And they can be very counterproductive, in fact, when it comes to investments in, say, just energy transition partnerships for countries, for institutional investors in Europe or so to invest in those. Right now, they would be investing in things that go against the taxonomy in order to make change possible. And that is very unfortunate. How is that going to change? Well, pinning some hopes on the International Sustainable Accounting Standards Board that is now active. Maybe that is a place that can help us get over some of these differences. But it will eventually have to be taken up by governments, and the Climate Club, for me, is a possibility to bring these kinds of problems to the table and push them. I agree with you with TCFD and Scope 3, but if we get into Scope 3, things get really complicated. The disclosure is very important. The question is what happens with what's being disclosed. And there, of course, it gets into questions. So for instance, how to make the carbon border adjustment mechanism work with a Scope 3 disclosure when you have long supply chains that cross countries' borders is a devilishly complicated thing to do. So the disclosure, yes, and you have institutions that do so. It's possible if we work on this. Industries have been able to disclose a whole range of other things in the past. They're able to do that, companies. But the question is what we do with the information that we get. I think I should stop it here so that I don't take the time from everybody else.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. I make sure we cover, as I said, the questions. Kazuo, you're next. And it'd be particularly valuable if you also picked up the issues of, debt, and how we also debt and cost of capital. Thank you. No, Kazuo.
That proper or other issues?
Yeah, no, you answer anything you want. But
yeah, okay, thank you. Let me start with the first question raised by Mr. Kobayashi on the energy efficiency. As far as I remember, in the early 1990s, Japan was one of the most advanced countries in terms of energy efficiency, next to Switzerland. But as the recent data shows that Japan is overtaken by UK or Germany, and US is approaching Japanese level in terms of energy efficiency. It's regret to say that. As for the green taxonomy, Professor Shirai-sensei raised, I would like to highlight the important work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, to develop a practical, flexible, and interoperable global baseline building on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework that can also be incorporated in more ambitious disclosure requirements and support jurisdictions' considerations of the ISSB standards as they implement climate and other sustainability disclosure rules, yes. And as for the carbon market, I would like to emphasize that the use of carbon market cannot be a substitute for the deep emission cuts necessary. But utilizing and designing of high integrity carbon market with robust safeguards can play an important role in mobilizing public and private sector finance, including results-based climate finance, unlocking social and environmental co-benefits, deploying clean, safe, and sustainable decarbonization technologies, as well as investing in nature-based solutions. And what else? Yes. As for the global South debt crisis, I am not expert on developmental economics. But basically, I think we need, there are various proposals on setting up international fund, like levying aviation or international trade of monetary transactions, to set up an international fund to support to alleviate debt crisis in developing countries. So maybe some other parties may be familiar with this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Babia, including on the Climate Club. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would try and keep this brief because there's not much time left. But I'd like to start with the first question concerning innovation and efficiency. In Japan, Germany, and the United States. Yesterday, I made the point, and I can refer you to my Asian Development Bank Institute working paper, which has more details, that the two major market distortions that are preventing a low-carbon transition are the underprice, particularly in the G7, are the underpricing of fossil fuels and the underinvestment in green innovation. And what's interesting, as I showed yesterday, is the fall in green innovation within the G7 countries. The US, Japan, and Germany are the three that particularly have fallen in the last 20 years. And that has implications for not only low carbon transition in those three countries and the G7, but for the whole world, as I showed yesterday. So this is a big concern, and I set up some policies how we could do that, how we could correct the underpricing of fossil fuels, use the money saved to fund more public R&D to support green innovation, including energy efficiency. On to the issue of private financing ESG. Thank you for raising that. I do presentations, I consult with ESG investors on this issue. And there are two avenues of ways into this for the investing community and businesses in general to increase private financing. The first is the increasing recognition by both investors and firms that climate risks are business risks. And in accompanying with that, we must also include regulatory risk and supply chain risk, are all things that are getting both investors and firms very much interested. As a result, what we're seeing gradually, and we need to see more of this, is a movement from just risk reporting, which is voluntary risk reporting, to risk disclosure, to actually risk mitigation and possibly mandatory risk mitigation. And I think the investment community, and particularly banks, are moving in that direction. There are proposals in the Security Exchange Commission in New York to move in that direction. The EU has brought in more mandatory risk reporting and mitigation. And both lenders and stakeholders, shareholders, are wanting to see actual action by companies. And that also means that investors are looking for more climate-friendly type of investments. And the second thing that's happening is because of that, we're seeing more and more adoption of internal carbon pricing by firms, and including internal carbon pricing by financial institutions evaluating the risk portfolio of their corporate customers. I think that's promising, but I believe that needs to move much faster, much more in that direction. And then the question from Pakistan and from you on the issue of fiscally constrained developing countries. I think this is a serious issue. I've been writing about this since the pandemic, talking about how do we do the post-pandemic recovery in developing countries. We could see the debt crisis building up while the pandemic was raging. And what we've seen now is the point where fiscally constrained governments have to think of creative ways of implementing climate policies that both raise money and can be used to achieve development goals. In my paper, I outlined several of them. I don't want to take much time, so I refer you to some of that work in the paper that explains some of the policies that could be adopted and that would be compatible with the SDG goals as well.
There was also a question about the politics of these policies in the US right now. So we let it pass, right? You know, I mean, clearly the very, very good policies that you mentioned are not seen universally in the US at this point as, in fact, climate in many circles has become a dirty word. So
Yes, but I think one has to be very careful here. Just like Hans-Peter quite quietly pointed out, is that we should translate regulatory policies into equivalent of carbon price. We should think about the subnational agreements and at the state level and regional level in the U.S., which there are several, which are already, as projections show, if they were supported and expanded, could reduce U.S. emissions faster than they currently are. So we must also bring into the picture what's going on at the subnational level. And that's also important for developing countries because some of the implementation of carbon pricing may occur not at the national level, but at subnational levels or at cities even and businesses.
yeah, no, I entirely agree with you. No, the question more was from the perspective of ESG investing, whereas the investors are, calling for much, more informed investment understanding and disclosure. In a political sense, there's been some pushback. I think in some sense that will play itself out in the favor of actually the investors, but that's a personal view. If I could come to you, Stormy, for your last set of observations, then I'll wrap up very quickly. You have only a minute, sorry.
All right, no, thank you so much. On the issue of taxonomy, I'm not so positive that we can agree in the G7 or the G20, just looking at our own EU experience, how difficult that was between Germany and France, for example, to agree on nuclear energy, if it's green or if it's not green, also hydrogen and some other issues. So it's probably going to be really, really difficult. With regard to the CBAM, as you know, the European Commission's proposal was pretty limited with regard to the industries covered, the most energy intensive, CO2 intensive traded products, which we just heard, steel, aluminum, and some others. The Parliament wanted to go a little further. It's still a pretty limited list in the beginning, but if it was to be extended, then we would run into a lot of supply chain issues, transparency, accounting, and so on. And we currently see this with the implementation of a due diligence law for supply chain due diligence in Germany, which is really, really hard to implement, especially for small, medium enterprises. So, and that is I would say that is limited in comparison to what we would see in an enlarged CBAM approach. And last point with regard to countries, policy space, way to go, and the United States. With all criticism I have towards the IRA, I think that was the only way the Biden administration could go in the current climate. Obama tried, a gazillion times to get any kind of regulatory legislation through Congress and failed. So Biden's learning was it needs to be a spending approach instead of a regulatory approach. So I would defend the IRA a little bit despite its trade diverting and problematic aspects because it will lead to a lot more money flowing into renewables. At the same time, I would love for the trilateral initiative on subsidies to be reinvigorated between the EU, the United States, and Japan, because all that big money flowing, public money flowing into that sector will also create a sucking sound for companies being sucked away from other countries, from the emerging economies, from developing economies. And we are creating a very, very, very unlevel playing field here. And those three big ones, they need to think about how we can mitigate that sucking away from investment.
Thank you. I was going to make that point that there are innocent bystanders in this game. I won't summarize. Let me just say that if you read the T7 communique, you will see that the key elements of this discussion are very, very well reflected, which allows me not to summarize because I'm out of only have 12 seconds to do it. But I just want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the audience and the excellent set of questions, and to say that this agenda really has to be on the top of our minds and at the bottom of our hearts. So thank you very much.